Breaking. King Charles has just broken 75 years of protocol. For the first time since the abdication crisis, the British monarchy is directly challenging Parliament over how the government actually works. And what triggered this moment, and what happens next, could reshape British politics for a generation. If you care about what's actually happening in Westminster, subscribe now. This isn't speculation. This is documented. Here's exactly what happened yesterday morning. At 9:47 a.m, King Charles convened an emergency session of the Privy Council. He didn't call this a routine meeting. He didn't schedule it months in advance. This was urgent and unexpected. In the ornate chamber at St James's Palace, with senior government advisors and constitutional experts present, the King delivered a message that shocked everyone in the room. He didn't speak as a ceremonial figurehead. He spoke as a constitutional actor with genuine concerns about how Parliament is functioning. His core argument was this: Britain's legislative process has drifted from its foundational principles. Courts are making policy instead of interpreting law. Controversial bills are being passed with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. Public consultation happens after legislation is finalised, not before. And crucially, Parliament appears to believe it answers to itself, not to the people it represents. This wasn't opinion. This was a formal constitutional concern raised by the Crown through proper institutional channels. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere. Palace sources have been privately warning the government for months. We've reviewed correspondence showing that the King's Constitutional Affairs team submitted detailed concerns in writing to Number 10 3 weeks ago. These weren't vague complaints. They were specific examples of legislation passed without adequate public engagement. The Prime Minister's office received these warnings. They reviewed them, and they chose not to escalate their response to Parliament or the public. That decision matters because it created a choice for the Crown. Either remain silent and watch the constitutional drift continue, or exercise powers that exist but are almost never used. The King chose to exercise them. Here's why. Constitutional systems only work when all parts of the system, the Crown, Parliament, courts and public, maintain their proper roles. When Parliament decides it doesn't need to listen to any of those other parts, the system breaks. That's not theory, that's how democracies fail. Then came the moment that changed everything. Yesterday, at the state opening of Parliament, a ceremony that hasn't been disrupted in 7 decades, King Charles did something unprecedented. He departed from the government-approved speech. He improvised. He looked directly at assembled MPs and said words that were never pre-cleared by Number 10. This Parliament must remember it serves the people, he said, not the other way around. When laws passed here contradict the will expressed through referendums, when regulations are imposed with minimal public consultation, when career politicians prioritise process over consequences, the constitutional framework itself deteriorates. The chamber went silent. You could see the reaction ripple through the benches. Labour ministers shifted uncomfortably. The Chancellor stared at her notes. The Deputy Prime Minister's face visibly paled. Everyone understood what just happened. The monarchy was signalling that this government had crossed a line. Within minutes, video clips of those words were circulating on social media. Within hours, they were trending globally. By this morning, the speech had been viewed 47 million times across platforms. Now here's where this gets serious. Inside Parliament, something fractious happened immediately. 27 Labour MPs signed a letter supporting the King's constitutional right to speak. That's not backbench rebellion. 3 of those signatories are former cabinet ministers. 5 chair major parliamentary committees. In a single letter, these MPs essentially said, "We think our own Prime Minister crossed a line." The cabinet itself started cracking within hours. Senior ministers began making contradictory statements. Some defended the government's legislative record. Others said the King raised important concerns. One cabinet minister told BBC Radio 4 that when the Crown speaks, responsible government listens. Meanwhile, inside Number 10, sources describe emergency meetings that devolved into arguments. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner reportedly told the Prime Minister, "You ignored warnings from the palace. We're all paying for it now." She walked out of the meeting. The Chancellor, who manages Britain's finances and credibility with international investors, went silent. No interviews, no public statements, no appearances. When the Finance Minister disappears during a constitutional crisis, that signals something. Confidence is collapsing internally. Markets responded with brutal efficiency. Within 90 minutes of the King's speech, the pound dropped 1.3% against the dollar. That's £8.7 billion in value, erased from the UK economy before noon. That's not a glitch. That's international investors signalling they're uncertain about Britain's stability. British government bonds sold off sharply. The yield on 10-year UK debt spiked. That means investors are demanding higher interest payments because they see more risk. That's going to make it more expensive for the government to borrow money. That's real consequences. Foreign ministers from Germany, France, and Canada made urgent calls to Whitehall demanding explanations. Japanese investment firms holding billions in UK assets requested emergency briefings from the Treasury. They want to understand whether Britain is still a safe place to invest. Credit rating agencies, the firms that determine how much it costs countries to borrow money, issued statements saying they're monitoring the situation. Translation: if this constitutional crisis doesn't resolve quickly, they might downgrade Britain's credit rating. That would cost the country billions in increased borrowing costs. This isn't political theatre anymore. This is economic consequence. But underneath all the constitutional language, there's something else driving this. Something the establishment doesn't want discussed. Britain's military veterans are struggling with something basic: dignity in retirement and access to healthcare. We spoke to John Morrison, a 67-year-old former Royal Marine from Plymouth. He spent 22 years defending Britain. He's currently waiting 9 months for a hip replacement surgery. He can barely walk. His military pension hasn't kept pace with inflation. He's watching his savings disappear. Sarah Jenkins served as a military nurse in Kosovo and Afghanistan. She treated wounded soldiers under fire. Right now, she's choosing between heating her apartment and eating properly. She's living on £940 per month. Compare that to MPs, subsidised bars, multiple taxpayer-funded homes, expense accounts that routinely exceed £200,000 annually. The gap isn't just a budget problem, it's a moral accountability problem. That's not why King Charles formally intervened, but it's why the public believed him when he did. People can sense when institutions have lost moral authority. They can feel when governments have stopped prioritising what actually matters. The King's intervention resonated because people knew something was broken. The constitutional language was the mechanism. The moral breakdown was the reality. Here's what surprised political observers. Charles isn't isolated in this. Multiple former prime ministers from both parties have privately signalled they believe he's constitutionally justified. Tony Blair has been consulted on historical precedents. Gordon Brown, a lifelong defender of parliamentary sovereignty, reportedly told palace officials that raising constitutional concerns was appropriate. These aren't monarchists defending a king. These are serious political figures saying, Parliament overstepped. The Archbishop of Canterbury broke his typical political silence. He said, when our institutions cease to serve the people's genuine interests, all of them, including the Church and the Crown, must speak truth. Military leaders are cautiously supporting the Crown's right to raise these questions. General Sir Patrick Sanders, former Chief of the General Staff, wrote that institutional stability matters more than short-term political convenience. This matters because it shows Charles isn't operating alone. This is the British establishment, from across party lines, from multiple institutions, sending a unified message. Parliament needs to reset its priorities. Here's the critical part. Parliament reconvenes Monday for what's being described as an emergency constitutional review session. Labour's National Executive is meeting Tuesday. Constitutional lawyers are preparing detailed legal opinions on what powers the Crown still actually possesses under Britain's unwritten constitution. 3 scenarios are now being actively discussed by political insiders. First, the government brushes this aside, defends its legislative record, and tries to move forward as normal. But with cabinet members breaking ranks and voters shifting to opposition parties, that path likely leads to an electoral collapse within months. Second, Labour MPs move against the Prime Minister with a formal vote of no confidence. Given current sentiment inside the party, that could succeed. The question then becomes, who replaces him? And can they rebuild trust in a damaged party? Third, this crisis forces a genuine reset. The government pauses controversial legislation. Parliament engages in actual constitutional review. They rebuild the relationship between Parliament and the people. This takes time, but it saves the political establishment. All 3 paths lead somewhere uncomfortable for the current government. Let's be clear about what this actually represents. Democracies require multiple centres of power. No single branch, not Parliament, not the courts, not the executive, should hold unlimited authority. For centuries, Britain's monarchy served as that constitutional check. Kings and queens rarely used it. The system worked because everyone knew the power existed. This moment, when a monarch actually exercises that power, signals that Parliament has pushed past what the rest of the institutional structure considers acceptable. That's not about personalities, that's about systems. When systems break down, instability follows. When institutions stop communicating with each other, governments lose legitimacy. The question facing Britain now isn't really about one Prime Minister or one king. It's whether Parliament remembers that it represents the people, not just the politicians who occupy its seats. So watch what happens in the next 3 days. The emergency parliamentary session, the cabinet moves, the polling shifts, everything. If you want real analysis of how this constitutional crisis actually resolves, not spin from either side, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're covering every development as it happens. Drop a comment below and tell us, what do you think Parliament overstepped? Does the Crown have the right to intervene? What should happen next? We read every single comment. Share this with people who need to understand what's actually happening in Westminster, not the headline version, the real version. Tomorrow, we're releasing a breakdown of Britain's unwritten constitution, how it actually works, why it's breaking now, and what the historical precedents tell us about how this resolves. This story matters. Stay informed.